Hey there, welcome back to the Aurelius podcast. I'm Zach Naylor, co-founder and CEO here at Aurelius, and your host for the show. We had an energetic and informative conversation this time with Jim Kalbach. Jim is the head of customer experience at Mural. Now that title isn't exactly what you might think it is. At Mural, customer success has little to do with actual product design and development. In fact, Jim spends most of his time working between the business, marketing, and product to ensure that their customers are getting connected and being successful with their product. Jim and I talked about his background, which is very much in UX, product design, and research, and how that led him into his current role. We heard from him about what some of the differences are between user experience, customer experience, and marketing. From there, we touched on a frequent topic for me, certainly, and for our show here at Aurelius of design in business. Jim's perspective is that UX design needs to be more open-minded when working with the business to become a more successful and effective designer or design leader. He shares with us some very useful tips on how to do this that are straight from his own experience in his impressive career. If you're someone who finds yourself trying to figure out how to make design more respected and prominent in your organization, you're going to want to make sure you listen to this episode. As I said, Jim works at Mural, which is a digital whiteboard solution. Because of that, we talked a bit about how a lot of the work we do in product, UX, and research is going digital. Many teams are no longer relying on physical or in-person ways of doing this work. We're seeing this happen in research too, which is why we built our very own product, Aurelius. If you're looking to create a user research repository or database to store all of your key insights or nuggets and get the most out of what you learn from research, we'd love to hear what you think about Aurelius. You can check it out for a 14-day free trial over at our website. That's aureliuslab.com. www.aureliuslab.com. Okay, here we go with Jim Kalbach. Welcome to the Aurelius podcast, episode 28 with Jim Kalbach, designer, author, and instructor. He wrote the book Mapping Experiences and is head of customer experience at Mural. Jim, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Yes, of course. It's definitely our pleasure. Let's jump in a little bit and talk with, the folks listening. If they don't know who you are and they're not familiar with your work, maybe tell us a little bit about what you've been doing recently and sort of the things that you're focused on.
Yeah, sure. I'm the head of customer experience at Mural. That's mural.co, which is one of the leading online whiteboards. So it's a solution, it's a tool that lets you collaborate visually online in the cloud, right through your browser, and you can think about doing all kinds of design work and creative work and research with teams that are distributed. So it kind of solves that problem. How do you have a viable design thinking workshop, or how do you do a remote design sprint? And you want to work with sticky notes and be visual. We kind of fill that gap. But prior to that, I actually have a background in digital product design. I've had various roles, both internal and external for agencies, more information architecture, and then a little bit of interaction design focus, but a lot of user research as well too. So I've always done everything, from usability testing to ethnographic, contextual inquiry interviews and things like that as well too. For the about the past 20 years. So I was in Razorfish in the late 90s, and the agency boom of the late 90s, and then .com crash, and survived all of that as well too. So I have a varied experience, but mostly with online digital products.
Nice. Well, tell us a little bit more about what you're doing then, as head of customer experience at Mural. Some folks maybe haven't had the chance to hold that kind of role. I mean, how is that different for you as opposed to being like what you might call an individual contributor or something that you've done in the past?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. For me, it was definitely a lateral step, but the thinking is very much the same. Instead of working in product teams and working with the medium of pixels and screens and navigation structures and things like that as the medium of what you're building, what you're trying to create, I'm a lot more on the relationships side of things, email campaigns, but also education, webinars, and things like that. So I'm part of the overall service experience at Mural. but I'm not part of the product experience. Very often we talk about user experience and the product experience, which is wildly important, of course.
Mm.
But that is contained in a broader brand experience or customer experience, as we call it there. So I'm leveraging a lot of the thinking and a lot of the things that I've learned in my career on the product side, on the digital product side of things, but in new ways. So there was some learning, and still trying to figure some of those things out. But I actually find that it's very comfortable position because I'm able to leverage a lot of the principles, a lot of the thinking, a lot of the thought that I learned on the product side of things.
That makes a lot of sense. And in fact, I don't, I think I have, sort of a parallel story, especially us in starting Aurelius. There was a lot of things when we started our company that I had no idea how to do, particularly marketing, which it actually sounds to me like a lot of your current activities might be classified as marketing. And I mean, truth be told, a long time ago, back when I was also sort of on the agency and like client service side of the world, I used to think marketing was kind of bullshit, right?
Yeah.
Because I thought everything was the product experience. That's what mattered most. And I found as well that the way I thought about problem solving translated very well into marketing challenges and sort of targets that you're trying to hit there. And then reality of it is, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah.
Marketing actually serves that function. Marketing done well actually serves
Yeah.
that function, but just in a different way.
Yeah. The word marketing, I think, is a little bit loaded because we think of marketers and people who are just trying to squeeze the market for a little bit more and appeal to people, manipulative. There can be some negative baggage and a very narrow-minded perspective of marketing. But I see marketing as everything post-launch on basically everything on the customer experience side once it's out there. And what I do, from the broadest sense of the term, what I do is very much marketing. Talk about customer marketing, content marketing, things like that. I approach it, my role right now, very much education, training, coaching standpoint too. The way that I like to think about it is our tool. There are ones and zeros in a database, and we can get pixels to do something on your screen, right? And that's all great. It needs to be good, but that gives our customers a superpower that they may not know how to leverage and wield. And I like to think that I fill that gap, that you have a product in the market, and there's a gap between what the potential of that product has. And a lot of that is around hand-holding or education, partnerships as well too, co-creating, things like that. So it's an extension of the product thinking, and I really see it as a layer of experience on top of the product experience. And it was really interesting for me because, again, a lot of the principles that I learned on the product development side of things, I'm applying, and I'm seeing both how important everything that I talked about as a UX designer actually is, because that has effects all the way out into the market on the go-to-market side of it. But at the same time, how sometimes narrow-minded feels like UX and UX research can be. That there is more beyond that as well too. So it's broadened my horizons, reinforced the importance of what I had done in my career before, but also showed that there is more to it. And I think a lot of people in our field, I think we need to get out there. And your story, Zach, was great. That once, oh wait, there is all this other thing, beyond just what we're concerned. I think getting into that, I think that's helpful. It's super helpful for me, I know, and I would encourage other folks to kind of get out and see other sides of marketing and other sides of the business.
I love it. I couldn't agree more. It's one of those things where, yeah, it was like a light bulb that went off, and I said, I understand now what marketing is supposed to be. I definitely had this colored perspective, perhaps by some of the bad actors that you've mentioned, and it's kind of like you get, if you think about what a used car salesman looks like or does, and then all of a sudden you get this bad idea of who that person is, and you're absolutely right. Until you have to do it, and you go, actually, this is a thing that serves a purpose of this other world that's very, very important to me. So maybe UX and design, right? And if those two things don't work well together, you don't have a successful product and company. It's just the truth of the matter. One of the things that you mentioned in there that people can be sort of narrow-minded, particularly even with like the research and stuff that they do. I'd love to hear a little bit more of your opinion and revelations on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just for me, it's being closer to leadership team and being closer to things like funding. Like we're a startup, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, particularly when you're an individual contributor, a decision comes down and you're like, where the heck did that decision come from? And just being closer to some of the uh, other types of decision making, not other types of decision, but there are other perspectives on the business on why decisions get made. And I think being exposed to some of that, partnerships, why are partnerships important for a business? Again, all these kind of much more relationship like decision making situations that a business is also in. Then you start seeing there's a different business logic that's not just as narrow-minded as sometimes we like to think. And I know as a UX designer, 15 years ago, I would pound my fist on the table and say, they don't get it. First of all, it's they, it's not
Mm-hmm.
they, it's us.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't get it. Well, actually they do get it. They're just saying that their thing is more important than your thing right now. And you know what? I'm starting to find out they're right a lot of the time as well too. So instead of just complaining about they don't get it, it's like, well, you got to understand why they're doing that.
Yeah, I no again, everything you said, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, a talk that I've been giving recently so very strongly advocates that. Okay, so let's just back up. I've been there, and I got to believe that that resonates with a lot of people. Pounding your fist on the table. What's the deal? You don't get it. You don't get design. In air quotes.
Yeah.
And the problem there is that, again, as you've said, it's not that they or whoever doesn't get it. It's that we haven't done a good enough job of understanding how what we do fits this larger need. So
I couldn't agree more with that.
So this talk I give, Jim, is about selling your ideas, which is actually a total. I mean, well, I'm going to be giving it in the future. So for anybody listening to this, it is a clickbait title, but let me just tell you, the substance behind it is very good because it's not actually about selling anything. Selling your ideas effectively is being able to very well understand the people you're working with and for. That's how you're most successful in doing that. And then, and actually, interestingly enough, once you do that, you start to see how your role and design can fit those needs better rather than taking a sort of combative or a combative stance.
I spent a large part of my career in a combative stance with PMs, with engineers, with marketing people, with salespeople, and it didn't serve me. It didn't serve me well. It was actually disservice. Because then that kind of shoeboxed a lot of the things that I was talking about when it should have been reversed, that I should have been bringing people in on the one hand, but also doing a lot more outreach and trying to have more empathy for what they're trying to, have empathy. We talk about having empathy for the users. Why don't you have empathy for the other roles in your business, right?
Bingo. That's a huge one. And I don't know what this is at least the 10th episode after the fact that we recorded with Christina Woodkey. Okay. And I continue using her quote. She said exactly that so many designers out there claim to have empathy for the people they design for, but almost none for the people they work with. And therein lies the exact problem. And that literally is the underpinnings of the talk that I've been giving and the things that I'm passionate about, particularly because you're right. We do this work. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, perhaps this narrow-mindedness of our industry as designers, we say, well, the way we're doing this is right. And that's actually correct. But it's incomplete, right? Yeah. And so so we approach this work as if it's not this, it's not right. But we haven't understood the full picture of right.
Yeah.
Right. So
I agree. I agree. So back to your original question, I think kind of stepping out and moving laterally out of a more product-centric role, sprints and launches and all that kind of stuff, and moving into a role that's much more closer to the market side of things. I think it's given me that broader perspective. But again, it's also reinforced a lot of the things that I said as UX designers. So fight for those things, right? Mm-hmm. So definitely hold your ground and don't give up for those small moments and all the good stuff that we've learned over the past couple of decades about good UX design. You do need to fight for those things, but also be more open-minded.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point too, because I think that's important to keep in mind. You're right. While it's very easy for us to sit here and criticize and say we need to be better, we need to be more sort of inclusive and like open-minded as to what's going on, the bigger picture. It's absolutely true. At the same time, you still need to hold true and stand tall with those things that are very important. Do you have any advice for people on that and sort of holding on to your roots where necessary, but then recognizing where you ought to be a little bit more open-minded and shift, maybe your opinion on things.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think when you're in an organization, large or small, there are levels and different types of dysfunction. And I don't want to say some organizations are more dysfunctional than the other. I always describe it as the grass is never greener. It's just a different configuration of brown spots. So, but you have a certain tolerance level with your configuration of brown spots, and you need to have some wherewithal to kind of stick with it. Because sometimes it's an elephant and you have to eat it, one bite at a time, and it's basically brick by brick. And after a while, you start looking down and you're saying, I don't want this configuration of brown spots, and then you need to change organizations. And you think everything's going to be better, but then you have different challenges. My advice is, well, the grass actually isn't greener. It never, ever, ever is. In my opinion, I've never switched jobs and said, oh, I got rid of all those problems. Oh, but wait, now I have the different ones, right?
Yeah.
So you're always, you're always in this kind of, particularly in larger organizations, this slow transformation role. And I feel a lot of what, design and UX is a lot of it is evangelizing. A lot of it is trying to convince other people that persuasion, that's a big part of our job, I believe. And to be a designer isn't just to be able to manipulate things on screens. It's you also have to then bring people into that world and, in a way, like you said, sell it. I mean, that's a great word there. Market. We can go back to marketing. How do we market what we do? And I think we've been overall pretty bad, actually, at doing that. Basically, though, you need to stick with it. I know Alan Cooper just wrote a piece. I don't know if you saw that thing where he basically says, if your managers don't get design, leave the org. And I'm thinking, I mean, I'm that's hyperbole there, but that was one of the things that he mentioned. And it's like, well, is that the thing to do though? Is it to run away or to stay? And that's your battleground, is to convince those managers, not convince them, but show them the value of what you do. I think that has to be part of design, at least where it is right now, right?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very critical point. Interestingly, I can play both sides of that fence because I have very much given that advice. It sounds like maybe Alan has, but in the right situation, if it's a place where there's willful ignorance, right? Just willing to say, it doesn't matter to me. I don't care to understand design.
Yeah.
But if there's no openness to it, then I mean, maybe that's a place where you do walk away. But I tend to err on the other side, which is where I think you're suggesting to say, well, have you understood what's important or valuable to them and help them see how design does that? Because if you can say in earnest that you've done that and you've tried to show them how your work actually enriches what they're trying to accomplish as well, and then they still have closed mind to it, well, then in my opinion, they're just not smart business people, right? Because I think anybody who's good in those roles is going to understand how design will impact and improve everything that we're trying to do there. In that case, you just don't want to be part of the sinking ship, right?
No, totally. And I mentioned thresholds, and everybody has their own thresholds. So when I hear somebody say, "I've been in this company for 5 years and I got to change," I get it. You've been doing that bricklaying, banging your head against the wall with that organization that's not willing, and all those things that you just described, and you just can't do it anymore. That's fine too. But I would say you got to give it a couple tries. You got to say, okay, I'm going to try this 3 times in 3 different ways. That might take a couple years, If you don't try, if you're basically just saying these guys don't get it, I'm out of here and walk off the set, I don't think that's good for design overall, because it's those people that need to be convinced, and part of our role is doing that persuasion, doing that convincing.
Totally. Yeah, and I mean, even just to take a little bit more of a world view on that, if all of us did it, nobody's going to get it. No company's going to get it, and then the next one you go to,
right, exactly. That's the thing. You can't just say we're all running away, because then it's just us talking to us.
We're all playing musical chairs. We're all going to these shitty companies where nobody, quote unquote, nobody gets it because none of us did the hard work. Had the discipline to do that. This ties back into sort of where we started with this, Jim, and asking about how your transition into this different role and this certainly leadership role, still in design, right? And how that's changed. It makes me wonder, something I've been thinking about recently is there's these like levels of designer. And I think people often wonder, like, how does somebody get to that level or that sort of place in an organization? Do you believe I'm of the opinion recently that happens when people are able to see that broader perspective, to see how this actually fits into a larger puzzle rather than just design being right. I don't believe the most successful people in those leadership roles, like yourself, head of customer
Yeah.
experience or whatever, um, are in that role just because they're good at fighting for design. I actually think that they're in those roles and they graduate up into those because they're able to help the entire company see
Yeah.
how this enriches everything. I'm of that opinion recently. I'd be curious to hear your
Yeah, I
thoughts.
mean, I can't answer your prompt any better than you just said it right there. I think that's exactly true. Is that the best design leaders don't have that super hyper microscopic. I can do the best design. This kind of our myth of the Johnny Ives. I just have to be a way better designer in that thing. That 13-inch thing that I'm working on. I don't believe that's true for 99.9% of us.
Mm-hmm.
Is that it is that outward perspective that makes a good design.
Yeah. In fact, I would argue that the best designers, and I mean like applied designers, doing the work, making the thing, right, moving the pixels, as you said.
Yeah.
Often those people do not graduate into these leadership roles because they love the craft of it so much, and they're so focused on that they're not actually able to see this broader perspective. It's not a bad thing because we need
Oh,
fantastic
I think it's a
applied
great thing.
designers.
I love working with people like that.
Yeah,
That's fantastic. Put your head down and create great shit.
yeah,
That's wonderful. That's a career. It just wasn't my path. I just knew that I was always way more interested in all kinds of other things going on around me, as well too. Which isn't to say you can't be a leader in that on the other side, on the craft side, because there are craft leaders as well too.
hmm
But then you're always going to have this organizational problem that we just talked about. So I think you need different types of leaders, right? You need that craft leader, but definitely for design to advance in general, or in your organization, or on your local project, there has to be somebody who's more of the diplomat, the ambassador, looking out towards those other aspects.
yeah. That's great. All right. Well, sort of tying this piece of our chat off, I'm
Yeah.
curious: is there anything that's jumped out and surprised you in sort of holding this role? As opposed to maybe someone who does the applied design or does the craft. Is there anything that's jumped out to you as like the biggest surprise, or I did not expect to have to deal with this as often as as maybe I would have anticipated?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a couple things in kind of the new stuff that I'm learning, but honestly, the first thing that popped into my mind was how right some of the things that people in UX and user research fight for, just how right and how impactful that can be.
Hmm.
Actually,
Do you have an
we talk
example?
about yeah, let's look at an example. Just a lot of like downstream friction, right? It's hard to prove the ROI of UX and design and things like that. Jared had a piece on that, I think, as well too, yesterday or whatever. And you try to put a dollar value to it and things like that, which fine if that's what you need to do, but just seeing how a small decision in the product can cause friction later on, and friction on both the externally on the customer side of things, in terms of causing a disruption or even bad will on the customer side of things, but then the friction that causes internally. Now
Hmm.
support people or people on my team are now jumping around, and if there's a lot of that, there's a ton of friction, and we're not able to do our job or a higher level thinking in our jobs because we're firefighting. So there's this magnification of these small things. That's why I say fight for the small things in the product, because that could potentially get magnified and send several people or a dozen people into a tailspin of firefighting and friction because of something that's way down there. So this idea of kind of root cause, like, well, let's fix it at the root, is very often when I was on the product side, that was the root.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. That makes a ton of sense. It's like the little things are the big things, but we don't see that
Right.
until all of a sudden you
Right.
throw 10,000 people at
Right.
it.
Exactly.
Yeah, right on.
And then our support lines light up because of that. And my guys are like, we have 40 messages in an hour or something like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, actually, I'm curious as a follow-up question. How do you manage that then? what happens there, right? Because there's got to be some sort of feedback loop that comes back to
Yeah.
address
Yeah.
the root. Like how do you work with that?
Yeah, I mean it's feedback loop, and now you're having a different discussion that leverages your sensibility. At least in my case, that leverages my sensibility on the design side of things. I'm using that logic to then re-argue why that should be done on the other side of the feedback loop.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But there definitely has to be a really good feedback loop, and there also has to be a will as well too. There has to be a will to go back to the root cause as well too, because sometimes it's okay, and I experienced this in my last job as well too, that if there was a problem, then you fixed the first touch point with that problem rather than going all the way back to the root cause. So if something was causing more calls to the call center, okay, then we need to make the call center more efficient. Like, well, no. Why don't you fix the root cause?
Yeah.
Because but here's the thing: the people who are saying let's make the call center more efficient, they're saying that because that's the scope of what they do, and they also just assume or think that there's nothing more that the product team or design team could do. They've done this is what we get from product,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a static thing. But I know, obviously, being in software design and on the design side of things, that there's a ton of decisions that people made that went into the product that you could easily just decide those things, and
Mm-hmm.
it would be smoother downstream. But a lot of folks downstream don't understand that process. So for me,
Interesting.
looking backwards, I'm like, wow, we could do a lot more down there, kind of thing. And it's interesting. So I try to stay close to the design team. We try to have a good feedback loop as much as possible. Of course, I'm in a startup. We have like 50 people. It's way easier, when you multiply that by 10 or 100 or 1,000, the feedback loop becomes really, really difficult.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I mean, that's great because I don't think that there's any better example of how, if there is such a thing as design thinking, or at least, just design in the approaches we take, how
Yeah.
that has a benefit and effect for net positive in other areas of the business. I don't think that there's any better story than what you just shared, because you can,
Yeah,
how that happened, and you see how it
that's
applies
right.
to, sort of like your link in the chain as to, yeah, if you got a leak in the roof, you don't need a bigger bucket to collect the water. You need to
Right,
fix the
exactly,
leak.
exactly. That's a great metaphor. Yeah. But our businesses do that all the time. They order more bigger buckets.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or then they build a pipe so that it just goes, right through the leak right up bad outside, and then you have this house that looks like a Frankenstein house, right? Mr. Potato Head. Your service becomes Mr. Potato Head because people are just putting buckets and pipes, and then well, just fix the roof. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Well, it's almost interesting too, because we see that, at least I know a lot of us saw that earlier on being maybe say 5-10 years ago. A lot of us in the UX world, we were working on these projects of like uprooting this super old existing technology because of that very problem,
Yeah.
where if people were just sort of bolting things on, where it was, it was held together with shoestrings and bubble gum, and then all of a sudden someone had to pay the piper, and now we've got to redo the whole thing, and it was pretty
Right.
painful.
Yeah,
So
I mean, it gets painful. The whole relaunch thing. Anytime I heard the word relaunch or replatforming or that kind of thing, that basically means the organization built up too much debt, technical debt, UX debt, all that debt. And basically, to avoid that is you got to be constantly fighting debt,
yeah.
constantly.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad you said that, because one of the things I was going to ask is, okay, so great, you got to establish this feedback loop. How do we influence more of even those micro decisions every day so that they don't amplify into, all of a sudden the
Yeah.
pipe running down the middle of the kitchen?
Yeah, I mean that's the golden question. Is know your craft first of all, right? You got to know that. But I think we also need to be able to contextualize our arguments from a different perspective, because other folks aren't going to be thinking the same way that we're thinking. So you have to understand. It's not just empathy. It's really like what is their motivation? I guess that's empathy. Like looking at things through their perspective. How are they seeing the words coming out of your mouth? And they're seeing that as this is the guy that sits in the corner and finger paints, and he's not telling me anything that's of value. So it's the ability to be able to shift your language and make arguments in a different way, but also to make convincing outcomes of your work as well too, and say, here, look, we did this and it had this effect. To be able to point back to that. Really hard to do. It's tough. It's tough question. If you hear me bumbling around here with this answer, it's because I don't know. That's the golden question, Zach.
Yeah. Well, then we're just going to end the podcast. I figured you had
There
the
you go.
answer.
Right, see everybody. Thanks for coming.
And we cue the outro music.
There you go.
Yeah. No, it is. It is very tough, but I think while you might not proclaim to have the answer, I think your answers are very, very useful for people to remember. Is that yes, being able to make that argument, or as the way I've maybe talked about it, sell
Yeah.
your decisions or recommendations from the perspective
Perfect.
that is not your own. I think that's
right. Yeah.
I'm biased, but I think that that's huge. It's certainly the way that I've found the most success in doing this work. So much for all of that. Shifting gears a little bit.
Yeah.
Author of Mapping Experience.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that if somebody's not familiar with the book.
Yeah, that's my second book, actually, with O'Reilly. My first book was called Designing Web Navigation, and that really reflects my background as an information architect, but also somebody who was focused on craft at that time. I just wanted to do tough IA projects and navigation projects and things like that. But that was 2007, and pretty much since then, I have been looking at some of these broader concerns that you and I just talked about. What's the marketing department doing? How do business people make their decisions? And I came across this this technique, or types of techniques, I should say, around mapping, and tried a bunch of things out. At the time, customer journey mapping was floating out there. I worked a lot with Indy Young's mental model diagrams, and then I came across this thing called service blueprinting, and I was kind of spinning around. I was trying a lot of them, and I was in a very fortunate position where I did have the ability to do some substantial projects in lots of those different areas. But I started to realize that there was overlap and there was confusion, and there really wasn't any like one thing where you could go and find out about mapping in general. Why do we do this? Why do we create these visual diagrams that we print out and put up on the wall, and then have a conversation around them? And well, it turns out, this word experience is really, really fuzzy and hard to define, right? Hey, we're experience designers. We don't just move pixels. Okay, show me your experience. It's one way to make that tangible for folks, right? Say, look, there's these feelings that people have before they even come to your service. There's this emotional curve, and they go up and down, and then they make the decision, and they feel like crap, and afterwards, or whatever that story might be. So it's a type of storytelling that I found actually was a way for me. It was a way for me to have these conversations that we just talked about in the first part of the podcast with other folks, because it kind of opened up. It opened up where I was coming from a designer focused on craft. It kind of opened it up, and now we're talking about people and human beings and all of your customers and things like that. And it was a way for me to actually kind of bring in other folks from the organization. It was like a centripetal force. It was like a magnet, and it was this thing that you can put up on the wall and get around like a campfire, right? So then you'd have this campfire, but you're sitting there at a campfire with marketing and business decision makers and other PMs and engineers and folks that we've worked with. But we're not just talking about let's launch the thing, or let's design the thing, or let's build the thing. We're talking about why are we doing this? How does this fit into a bigger context? So for me, mapping was my gateway into this, these other types of conversations that I needed to have that you and I were talking about. But it was a way. It also leveraged my skills as an IA, a lot of structure, as a user researcher, having empathy for people, and kind of really combined a lot of my previous skills. And I wrote the book to really just kind of make sense of what I saw in this area with all these different terms and techniques. And I made a lot of mistakes. And I just wanted to share all the mistakes that I made and say, here's how I put all of this together, the techniques, and then brought that into an organization and used that to facilitate these conversations. And I just wanted to put that down, and that's the book.
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting too. I appreciate your candor to be able to say here. I wanted to be able to share all the mistakes that I made because rather than trying to give everybody this shiny polished thing of well, here's your blueprint, here's the way you do it. Actually, here's all the things that you ought not to do to hopefully you can learn to do that better. I'm curious if somebody were to ask you, well, then what are the fundamentals? What are the basic building blocks of doing this really well? I mean, how would you answer that?
Well, in a couple of ways. I mean, I think there are some principles that I like to talk about. And then I also broke up the technique into 4 different phases, and that's how, if I give a workshop, basically talk about how you initiate a project, and how you do the research, and then how you put it together, and then how you engage other people. But I think for me, all of it, to answer your question really succinctly, it's really about engaging other people. That so many people focus on the deliverable,
Hmm.
whether that's a persona or something else. But in terms of mapping and experience mapping and things like that, there's this focus on the thing. It's like, I want to make a map. That is not your goal.
Hmm.
The goal is to have a conversation. The goal is to convince other people. So it's not about the map, the noun. It's about mapping the verb.
Yes.
I talk a lot about, you have to take your map maker hat off, and that map maker hat is really important because you want valid research, you want a compelling visualization, and all that stuff. So it has to be a solid map, but you have to take your map maker hat off and become a facilitator. So a lot of what we were talking about also earlier points to a shift, I think, or not a shift, but in addition to the designer toolkit, which is designer as crafter, but designer as facilitator as well
Hmm.
too.
Hmm.
And that's what I found myself. I was in far more facilitation roles, and really trying to lead conversation, not just beg for conversation, but I was now leading the more strategic conversations as well too. So my overall bottom line message is, make it an engaging, collaborative experience
Hmm.
over time, to talk about what's represented in something like a journey map or an experience.
Yeah, that's really, really wonderful. Particularly the part where you're saying like creating the map is not your goal. That's not the outcome. That doesn't give you the win.
Yeah,
What gives you the win, or the successful outcome, is having a conversation that leads you to the right place.
yeah.
I would argue that that is true of everything we do in design.
I agree. Yes, I'll agree with you. Yeah,
Yeah, because back back in the day when we did a lot of wireframes and all this stuff, right? Like especially when we were on the, I mean, you said you used to be on the client service side and working
yeah,
with customers. In that case, we always thought that these documents we made, or these decks, or everything else, they were these like canonical documents that people were going to
yeah,
put, hang up on their wall and talk. That never happened. They
yeah.
ended up in the trash. What was
Right.
important was that they were a means, to your point, of
Yeah.
facilitating a conversation that took us to the next step, because that was the real goal or outcome.
And I would say the method around a lot of those things too was a black box. So I remember doing wireframes, like I'd get a bunch of requirements in whatever form that was from the client. And then 2 weeks later, I'd come back and go, ta-da, and here's a deck of wireframes. And you're like, where did these come from? I didn't, not built here. These aren't mine, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
So going back to the mapping example, what I suggest is, you're initiating the project and you're trying to define the various facets and aspects of maps and where it begins and ends and that kind of thing. Do that with your client. You're doing the investigation. Do that with your client. You're visualizing it. Do that with your client. So it's the methods that I think we need to open up and be less black boxy.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really big deal. I think particularly with research, um, because research, at least for me, in the most basic form, is it's getting us answers to questions that we don't have answers to today, right? To
Yeah.
make better decisions about whatever it
Yeah.
might be.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you start answering questions that people don't know they had,
Yeah.
they're less they're less
Yeah.
likely to listen to what the answers lead them to.
Totally.
So to your point, yeah, like bringing the methods, just sort of saying, well, here's what I think that we need to know to make a better
Yeah.
decision about this, to have better conversation about this. If everybody can agree to that, we can go, you know what? I know how to help get us that answer.
Yeah.
Let's doing that. Do we all agree that that would be helpful if we had an answer to that question? Yeah, awesome.
Right. Exactly.
Don't
Yeah.
worry, I'll take that away. We'll do that. We'll come back with an answer, and then we'll talk about what that means.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I'll definitely agree on particularly from the research perspective, as well too. I think the really powerful thing there too is if you have this, open engagement, collaborative kind of mindset when you approach any project, persona project, a research project, a mapping project, a wireframe project. I think what that opens up is the opportunity for folks inside of your organization to get contact with customers. I,
Hmm.
I always say that I've been fortunate because I've always been in roles where I get to sit next to people and watch them use our products and services, or I get to talk to people on the phone, out there, both as a designer and now, particularly now in my current role, that I'm right out there with our customers. Think about how many people in your organization never ever talk to a customer. right?
Yeah.
It's a lot when you think about, engineers and operations people and things like that. But if you're thinking about a research effort or a mapping effort more as a means or a possibility for people to get exposure, direct exposure to customers, I think that's as healthy as just saying we're doing research.
Yeah, no question. Well, and I think the fundamental point there too is nature abhors a vacuum. So in lack of customer contact, we
Yeah,
create these movies in our head of what's
yeah,
probably happening for customers, and we make decisions based on that
yeah,
because,
yeah,
the show will go on.
yeah,
Decisions will
yeah,
get made whether or not they're informed by something
yeah.
we actually have learned about the people we're building stuff for or not.
I've literally had situations where I had a fairly high level stakeholder come out to me with me on one customer interview, and he realized the film in his head was completely wrong. He was
Really?
in the wrong film. Yes. And it was just from one person. Not that the quantitative sample size meant anything to him, but what he learned in terms of that guy's logic, the customer's logic, he thought, wow, if there's even a fraction of people out there that think that way, and he extrapolated and said, actually, that's how that work gets done. Well, our solution isn't what I built it up to be in my own head with my own marketing film.
That's
Right?
really fascinating. Is there
Yeah.
any more detail you can share around that and how
Uh,
that played out?
Probably not, but I have this interesting kind of mental hobby where I'm trying to collect these sample size of one use cases.
Mhm.
And there's the famous, the OXO potato peelers and the OXO, the Good Grips brand.
Oh, okay, sure.
That the story goes that the founder created a potato peeler because he was watching, I believe it was his wife who had arthritis, try to peel a potato with um, with a regular potato peeler, and he said, well, this should be more ergonomic for her. So this whole line of ergonomic kitchen tools came out, sample size one,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
But it's not the sample size; it's the logic to say, oh, wait a minute, kitchen utensils are not ergonomic. Therefore, there might be a market opportunity if we make ergonomic kitchen utensils, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Another example that I keep in my mind is apparently Jeff Bezos saw someone opening packaging once, like clamshell packaging and things that you need like a chainsaw to open up. We've
Mhm.
all been frustrated with package rage, right? And then he developed this program, and I think you can still find on the Amazon website against packaging rage. Right? I forget what exactly the program is, but the point is he saw one person and said this has got to change, right? So
Mhm.
very often it's not the sample size, it's the logic and the rationale that you gained from a sample size of one, right? Just to say, hey, I have the wrong film in my head on people buy stuff from Amazon, they open it up and they're joyful. It's like people buy stuff from Amazon and they get it home and they can't open it up.
Yeah,
Well, if that happens even a fraction of the time, that's not a good experience, right?
right,
Mm.
right. That is really, really interesting. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, we're coming up towards the end of our
Yeah.
time here, and I'm quite sure that if we don't stop, we can go for a whole another hour. But I want to be respectful of that for you.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, as we're sort of wrapping things up here, one of the things that I've been starting to do with each of our guests is ask them this question, which is, if I were to have developed temporary amnesia and I forgot everything we talked about, what's the salient point? What's the one most important thing that you feel like people should really take away from our conversation?
Right. I think particularly if you're on the research or the design side of things, it is to fight for those things that you believe because small moments do matter in general in
Hmm.
life, but the things that the things that you care about do matter on the one side. So this is kind of a two-sided coin here on the one side. On the other side, there are other reasonable and important perspectives in an organization that makes a business move
Hmm.
that will be different from yours. And rather than resisting those other perspectives, we need to go out and learn more about that,
Hmm.
so that we can position our value, our benefit, be able to position that in different ways to different people at different times. So also be a lot more open minded. So stick to your guns, but be way more open minded.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
When you come across those points of resistance or people maybe who don't get it lean into it rather than build a wall up against it.
And lean into it in a collaborative way. Like, don't be combative. I was way too combative in most of my career, and it just served me.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's very, very good advice. Yeah. I'm curious, is there anything that you'd like to share with folks listening that maybe we haven't talked about in the show?
Yeah, I mean, in my current role as head of customer experience at Mural, again, Mural is an online whiteboard. We're really looking at the kind of the problem space of digital collaboration. I think a lot of the work that we do, and particularly when you think about workshops and design sprints and things like that, it to some degree and I'll say it's stuck in the past, right? It's 2018 and we're putting very important thoughts and information on sticky notes on walls and rolling up butcher paper and sending that across the country. Can't tell you how many times after a workshop I've rolled things up, stuffed them in my suitcase and said, "Oh, this is important information." If it's important information, it's going to end up digital, right? So I think we need to, talk about digital transformation, which is a total buzzword, of course. But I think, design research, we need to think about how we're going to transform a lot of what we do. And Mural is there, and I totally believe, as a designer myself, but now someone who's a vendor, service provider in solutions for digital collaboration. I believe that in the very, very near future, we're going to be working a lot more digitally in general. And that there's tons of advantages there as well too. And by digitally, I mean, doing 5-day design sprints without a scrap of paper. I believe that's absolutely feasible. Not only feasible, but there's benefits to it. That what we're going to say is, "Ooh, that workshop's too important. We better do it digitally, or even we better do it remote." To be honest with you. So I'm focused a lot on distributed teams and remote work as well too. It's a soft skill. It's a softer side of what we do, but I think it's going to be more and more important for folks to be able to have the skills to be able to survive if they're not face to face.
Yeah. Well, we already see a trend moving in that way, so I think that I think your inclination is probably accurate.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And I'm here to say it's all possible for those naysayers say that's impossible. No, it is possible, and there's tons of benefits as well too. And I'm seeing all of those. So I'm happy to share more about that if anybody wants to contact me. I love talking about that topic as well.
Awesome. Well, I was going to ask is if people want to get in touch with you and continue this conversation, maybe ask some questions, how can they do that?
Yeah, sure. So I'm out there on Twitter. It's at Jim Kalbach, no space, no dot, just at Jim Kalbach. I have a blog that typically just makes me feel guilty about myself because I don't post there, blog guilt. But it's experiencing-information.com, a pretty long URL, experiencing-information-one-word.com. I have a thing there where you can contact me as well too. But I'm happy to give my email address or find me on LinkedIn, first of all, as well too. But my email address is jim.callback@gmail.com.
Okay. We can make sure we have links to all those things.
Yeah. Throw that up there. Yeah, that'd be great.
Awesome. Well, Jim, this has been a very energetic and very awesome conversation we've had with you, and I appreciate you taking the time.
I appreciate you asking me. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. All right, everybody. We will see you next time. If you enjoyed this episode, consider leaving us a rating on iTunes or wherever it is that you listen to our podcast. And also, you can fill out our podcast survey, where you can let us know if someone awesome that we should have on the show, and even tell us about the things you would want to hear about, topics that are interesting for you. You can check that out in the show notes or on our website. Thanks for listening to the Aurelius podcast, the show where we talk with brilliant minds about user research, UX design, and building great products that meet the needs of real people and what you learned about them. Aurelius is a user research and insights tool for design and product teams. Aurelius helps you add, tag, organize, search, and share all of your user research notes and customer feedback insights to figure out what you learned faster and easier than ever before, so you can make awesome designs, products, and features. Check us out for a free trial at aureliuslab.com. That is AURELIUSLAB.com. Or find us on Twitter at Aurelius. We'll see you next time.